Before we can use the software, unless we understand the basis of qualitative, the reason for qualitative, it may be difficult to apply the software. So for today and possibly tomorrow, we are going to be looking at the foundation. But today is strictly about the paradigm, what qualitative is all about. Then tomorrow we talked about the coding. How can we do the coding? Either for manual, that is traditional, or for software. Then next tomorrow, I'm going to introduce you to the software interface. What are the things we are going to come across in the software? Then how can we do the analysis manually? Then on the fourth day, we are going to go into the Nvivo to demonstrate, to import, and to begin the analysis. And also how to export whatever we do. Then on the final day, we are still going to try our hands on the software usage. Then we are going to look at how we can report whatever analysis we must have done. So that is a rundown of everything we shall be discussing from now till our the day that we're going to round up. So I want us to prepare our mind that qualitative analysis, qualitative research is different from quantitative research in so many ways. According to this scholar, Albert Einstein, that most of us know, he said that not everything that can be counted count. That means not everything we can look at from quantitative perspective. Not every problem, not every issue we can look at, we can examine, we can analyze, we can study using quantitative approach, because it is not all time that what can be counted counts, and that not everything that can count can be counted. So meaning that sometimes we need to go beyond counting. We need to go beyond number. We need to go beyond quantitative and examine certain things using qualitative, because qualitative is a natural way of carrying out analysis. It is a natural way. It is a form of analysis that allows us to look at issues, whether it is monitoring, whether it is evaluation, whether it is academic research. There are some issues, there are some complex issues, there are some topics that we cannot look at them quantitatively. So meaning that some of this inquiry has to be done based on the experience of those we want to examine. When we say experience of those we want to examine, it means the experience of those that are affected directly. And in qualitative paradigm, it is a form of social inquiry that strictly focuses on the way people interpret their experience, the way people will explain what they have experienced. Unlike in quantitative, that the theory will be the guide and you design the questionnaire, you have already limited them to certain options. Even if their option is not within the one you limited them to, they may still have something to say within their mind. Quantitative will limit that. But in quantitative, it allows the people that are affected, that we want to study, to interpret the situation by themselves in their own way. That is what qualitative is all about. Qualitative researcher uses qualitative to understand human behavior and the reason that determine that behavior. Not all the time that we get to know the reason behind certain things when we explore a study using quantitative. So qualitative as an approach always allow a researcher to get to know the reason behind certain behaviors of people. Similarly, qualitative research, qualitative approach allow researcher to get to understand things from their natural perspective, happenings from their natural setting. So that is why qualitative always look at why and how. Why something happens, how something happened, we get to know all that through qualitative. So they say qualitative method investigate the why and how of decision making, not just what, where, and when. So what, where, and when are certain areas that we may not be, we can only examine in quantitative, but qualitatives allow us to look at why something happens, how something happens. That is why qualitative is seen as a kind of studies that allow us to explore, that allow us to know something that are not known. That is why they refer to it as a travel, a journey that will give us the opportunity of knowing certain things we don't know before. So qualitative is used especially in area where certain things are not understood, areas where certain things are not known, while quantitative are only used for areas that are already explained by theory, area that are already explained by literature. But areas that are not explained, that is what we use qualitative for. That is why they refer to qualitative as a method that allows the researchers to travel, to explore. A qualitative approach is a method that disconnects from already established answers. We then go for natural answer, go for things that have not been captured by already existing studies. Also, qualitative allows reflection. Reflection. It gives us the opportunity to reflect on what is happening, then to interpret what is happening. Generally, qualitative and quantitative approach look at research from different perspectives. Quantitative look at research from deductive approach, while qualitative look at it from inductive approach. When we say deductive, which is the area that are known for quantitative, it means it is an approach that is referred to as top down, top down. When you begin from the top and come down, that is quantitative and that is deductive. For instance, when theory determine what you want to do, when you derive the variables, you derive the constructs, and you derive the dimensions of your studies from quantitative. You now use those variables you have discovered from theory or literature to study the area you want to study. So at the end of the day, a quantitative researcher is trying to confirm what theory says, whereas in qualitative, it is inductive, meaning that it is a kind of study that tries to look at something, getting the answer from the data collected. Everything that is going to be discovered from qualitative is inductive. It means from the data gathered from the field. Nothing from theory, nothing from literature. Everything from the data collected. Though a researcher who is possibly not too experienced can introduce deductive to qualitative, where the study is already where many people have already worked on in area or a problem that many researchers have examined have discovered many answers. A qualitative researcher can borrow some of the variables to do the qualitative. When that is done, that is deductive. But when the researcher used all the answers, all the findings determined from the data, that is inductive. So we get to understand this as we move on. Sometimes they refer to quantitative as positivist. The scholars in quantitative are usually referred to as a positivist, while researchers in qualitative are referred to as a interpretivist. Interpretivist. So that's the two paradigms of qualitative and quantitative. Let's get to understand qualitative more. What are the philosophical paradigm? What are the meaning of qualitative? What are the determinant of qualitative, or why is qualitative qualitative? Number one, qualitative is qualitative because the meaning, the data, the finding is socially constructed. Qualitative believe that meaning to issues, meaning to findings, meaning to happenings, or answer to our objective are socially constructed. It means that things that happens are based on lived experience. There are people we want to collect data from. That is our sample. Their answers are based on their experiences. So it means those who have experienced certain things that we want to study. That is what they mean by meaning is socially constructed in qualitative. It is not about what a literature says. It is not about what a theory says. It is about what the people that experience it, what they feel, how they feel it, how they have experienced it. That is qualitative. That is why it is usually referred to as a natural approach of examining a problem. So also, qualitative believe that the world or reality is not fixed. That is, situation, problem, they are not fixed. We can't always look at a problem from one perspective. Things changes. If we look at, for instance, COVID-19, if you want to look at attitude of people to COVID-19 protocol, people in America have different attitude, though they ask them to obey the same protocol, but their attitude to it are different. People in Africa, their attitude are different from those in US. So meaning that we cannot use the same yardstick to look at a problem. Whereas theory wants us to use the same perspective to look at problem. So, but qualitative is saying the world is not fixed. The world is not consensus. That means different people have different experiences, different view, and different perspective to issues. So that's what they mean by the world is not consensus, different experiences. When you look at the diagram, when you look at the graphics or the picture you are seeing on this slide, where you have different people seated on chairs around a table. They are trying to solve a problem. They are trying to solve a puzzle. We can see them in different color. What that means is that these are people with different experiences, and each of them has something to contribute to solving the problem. Each of them needs something to add to solve the problem. If the last person did not contribute, the problem will not be resolved. It means that these are the people that are affected. These are the people that can explain it from their perspective. We can see that The puzzle they are trying to solve require all of them to contribute. So that is what they mean by the world is not a consensus. We don't have different puzzles. We don't have different answers. We don't have different experiences. So qualitative is saying that in collecting data, especially on certain phenomena, the people that are affected should be given the opportunity to express themselves freely, openly, based on their view, based on their experiences. Then again, qualitative belief that the world is not a measurable phenomenon. We cannot use the same yardstick to measure phenomena. I've given you the example of phenomena of COVID-19. COVID-19 is a phenomenon. It's a problem that is affecting the whole world. That's why it is a phenomenon. If you want to study it, we cannot use the yardstick of another country to look at how people in another country deal with it, because the work is not a measurable phenomenon. It's not something we can just categorize into 1 and 2, A and B. No, you have to give audience to everybody concerned to express themselves. Also, quickly, qualitative is an approach that look at multiple sources and multiple interpretation. Different sources can be used for qualitative. And that is why interview is a source, observation is a source, document is a source. This will be explained in detail later. But the qualitative philosophy believes that there are multiple sources and multiple approaches to getting answers. Then again, just as I've told you before in the previous slide, qualitative believe that inductive data analysis is the most ideal, it is the most natural to get to analyze data. So rather than generating data from existing work, rather than theory determining how we want to collect data and the direction of the data as variable from theory normally give guide, qualitative believe that everything we want to analyze must come from the data. That is why they refer to it as a inductive. Then qualitative provide answers to social and behavioral contexts, which may be lost if we quantify it. So not everything can be quantified. There are certain things that we need to analyze using textual data. Understanding of reason behind certain things. We can only have a good result if we analyze it qualitatively. Opinions of people can only be analyzed when we do it qualitatively. Then, why do we need to use qualitative research for certain studies? What are the reasons why we use qualitative research for certain studies? If the concept is immature, so the reason why we use qualitative, if the concept we are looking at, if the concept we are researching is immature, if our study, the problem we want to examine has not matured to the extent that there are many studies on it, then it is better to go for it qualitatively. That is why qualitative is required. If there are lack of theories, you know, there are some studies, there are some problems that we may not get theory that explain it. We may not get literature that explain it. So qualitative is required if we are faced with such predicament. Then qualitative is necessary when the notion that available theory may be inaccurate. Maybe the theory that are existing cannot guide us appropriately. Maybe they are inaccurate to explore a problem, then we should know that the study require qualitative. So if the research participants can authentically describe our interpretation of our experience, then it means we need to use qualitative. Because there are sometimes that some theories are meant for the Western world. If we want to apply it to our society, especially in Africa, it may be wrong, it may be different. For instance, doing evaluations, doing monitoring in African countries is different from the kind of results we are going to get if it is done in Western world. So meaning that there are theories that cannot guide us properly on certain things, then we need qualitative. When there's a need to explore and describe a phenomenon, that means not much studies have been carried out on it. Then it means we need to explore using qualitative. If there's a need to develop a theory, that is, if there's a need to come up with a template that will be guiding people, template that people can be using to understand certain things. Maybe there is no theory that explains it. Let's take coronavirus, for instance. Coronavirus outbreak started about a year ago, precisely February, March last year. A lot of things were not understood about coronavirus. No theory that explained the characteristics of coronavirus. So most of the studies that guided us to understand COVID-19 at the early emergence of it were done qualitatively. They interview people that were affected. They will interview people that are treating the affected persons. They interview people that were cured of it, people that were the victim. So when an area has not been explored, when an area is new, then we should know that qualitative is the right approach to use. Then again, if a problem requires in-depth study, then we should know that qualitative is the appropriate. In-depth study in the sense that a problem is existing, it has defied many solutions, then we need to explore it from all sides. That means qualitative can be a good approach. Sometimes when we want to look at a problem in depth, we may decide to bring in mixed method, meaning that application of quantitative as well as a qualitative approach. And also, nature of phenomenon may not be suited to quantitative measures. If in quantitative, we need to measure the variable, the concept, the construct. Maybe the phenomenon we want to look at is not open for such measurement. Then we can always use qualitative. To measure using qualitative, most of the approaches are primary and secondary approaches of data collection. The primary involve interview, observation. The secondary involve content analysis, that is qualitative content analysis and document analysis. Sometimes they call it textual analysis, sometimes they call it discourse analysis. These are secondary qualitative data collection. The interview we talk about, we shall get to apply them later on in our training. Interview are basically two types: in-depth or face-to-face. In-depth interview or face-to-face interview, whichever case. Then the second category of interview is a focus group discussion. All this we are going to quote, then we are going to report. How can we report interview, in-depth interview? How can we report focus group? We are going to do all that on our last day. Then the second primary data collection in qualitative is under observation. And by observation, we mean participatory observation, non-participatory observation. Those are the two methods of observation. Participatory is when the researcher joins the people that he wants to study in what they are doing, and at the same time studying them. When the researcher joins them in whatever they are doing, this method is usually used by ethnographers, people who study the culture of people and how culture is affecting the life of people. So that is participatory. The researcher must join them in doing what they are doing in order to understand it better. The other observation is non-participatory, where the researcher will not join them. The researcher can simply look at, can simply stay afar, stay away, stay apart, just be monitoring them from away. So we can use this where if we join them, or if they know that we are studying them, if they know we are observing them, it may change their behavior from natural setting. That is when non-participatory is adopted. That means studying them, collecting data from them without them knowing that you are collecting data from them. That is what they mean by non-participatory observation. You observe them, or they don't know you are observing them. The other one is participatory. You observe them, they know you are observing them, you are part of them. So then the third leg is mixed method. That is when you combine the two approaches of quantitative and qualitative. Because if the issue you are looking at is complex, and most of our studies these days are complex, to use one method may not be adequate. So now I want us to look at the approaches, the design approaches, the research design in qualitative, how we can approach qualitative research. So when you want to do a qualitative research, there are many approaches you can use. There are many design approaches you can use. There are basically 6 categories. There are generally 5, but we added mixed method to it in order to be comprehensive. So narrative design is one method of design in qualitative. Narrative, the use of story as data. When we talk about looking at biography, studying biography, looking at how people see life, studying them in order to understand them. So this approach is used especially for biographer to study people who have something to contribute to the society. So that is one approach of design. The second one, okay, let me move on. Let me elaborate on it. For instance, narrative approach is, as we said, is a kind of design in qualitative where the researcher is looking at the life history of somebody, and we want to use his life history to explain certain things to the world. So it is a kind of approach where the subject of research is usually one or two. It could be a family, it could be one person. So in this kind of approach, it is account of an individual that is being told in a scholarly work form. Most of the biography and autobiography that we come across, they are done through narrative. So that is why it's always better to use narrative anytime we want to look at an individual. So that is one approach. The data collection for this approach is simply one or more, but very small number of people. The sample size is just one person or more. And the technique for data collection is through multiple. It can be record, that is documents that are recorded, diary that are written. It could be interview. of the person, interview of the person as a means of data collection. Then observation also can be used to collect data. Observation, we can observe the person we are studying to collect data. This kind of design is not commonly used by academic researchers. They are usually used by donor, usually sponsored research, sponsored agencies. Most time, the people whose biography is being written are usually the sponsor of this kind of design. But sometimes donor agencies sponsor this kind of research design also. The second one is phenomenology. By phenomenology, we are referring to a study that involves a phenomenon, a study that involves something that is highly complex and we needed to understand it. The world needed to understand it, especially if it affects the world. So for instance, coronavirus is an example. Coronavirus, COVID-19, is a phenomenon that affects the entire world. And the world needed solution to it. And part of having solution to it is to understand the behavior of the virus. If we don't understand the behavior of the virus, there may not be solution. So I said the other time that most studies that were carried out at the early emergence of coronavirus were done qualitatively because the answer can only be derived by interviewing the people that are affected, people that are involved in the treatment. So things like that, phenomenological study is what is the design. And in this kind of design, we are trying to know what makes it different from other design is because phenomenology is a design which is trying to know the inner experiences that are yet to understand, inner experiences of people that are our samples. Coronavirus, for instance, is less understood. Most of these problems are not obvious for researchers to know, especially at the early stage. So the inner feeling, the inner experience, the inner pain can only derive when an interview, when a focus group or observations were carried out. And this method is called phenomenology design because of the complications, because of the spread, the extent of it. Other issue that phenomenology are usually applied are issues that has to do with health. And that is why many health scientists, many medical doctors, nurses, they are carrying out research, mostly using phenomenology, mostly using qualitative research. So issues like what do we call it? Human trafficking. It's a good example of what we can use phenomenology for. And in collecting data for this design, the sample size, according to scholars, the sample size, they said, should not be less than 15. That is the recommendation. The sample size is usually between 15 to 25. And the data collection approach is in-depth interview and focus group, or either of them, or observation. But in-depth interview is required. Focus group can be combined. Observation can be combined as well, or just in-depth interview. Then quickly to the third one. The third one is grounded theory. When we say grounded theory, we are talking about a research design in qualitative where the researcher is trying to come up with a theory, or sometimes they call it templates, sometimes they call it model, to use as a guide for others to be replicated in other areas, to be used as a guide to examine other areas, to be used as a guide for people to use to solving problem. So graded theory is one of the most difficult design in qualitative. Many students on academic research, they don't always want to go into this kind of qualitative because it is very complex. The process, the analysis, they are very complex. But the complexity of this design is because the findings from it are regarded as theory. When we say theory, grounded theory, we are referring to a theory they refer to as a substantive theory. Substantive theory is different from ground or formal theory. Formal theories are those ones we use in our analysis, we use to guide our research, we use in school to understand problem. Those are formal theory or ground theory. Those ones have been propounded by scholars. Some propounded as far back as 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago. Some of them may not be suitable. Some of them may not be applicable to our situation now. So grounded theory is a design that is meant to generate its own theory, to generate a model or template on how a problem can be solved. So that's why they call it grounded theory. It is meant to generate a substantive theory to address a problem. The difference between grounded theory and the formal theory we used to know in our academic activities is that grounded theory is meant to address a particular problem, a particular kind of problem, and that problem will be examined in depth. That problem will be looked at thoroughly. So anywhere similar problem occurs, grounded theory template, that's the model generated, can be used. But the other theory, formal theory, can be used for any kind of problem. For instance, there is a theory called UTAUT, maybe technology acceptance model. People in engineering uses it. People in sociology uses it. Communication use it. So that is formal theory. But in this theory we are talking about, it has to do with theory that will explain a certain problem, and whatever findings that accumulated into theory can be used to look at the same problem happening elsewhere. So this type of study design has many scholars. Because they have many variants, different approaches. They use different approaches for grounded theory. The first set, which was in 1965, Glasser and Strauss, they were the one that propounded grounded theory as a design in qualitative research. Two of their students, Cobbin was the student, Chalmers was the student of Glasser. They came up with their own variant of grounded theory. That is, updated it or added something to it. So there are about 2 or 3 variants of grounded theory. But the most important thing that is common to all these variants is that the process is intensive, and the process is more rigorous than other kind of approaches. And the second thing, but one thing that differentiates them is the belief that literature should not be used. Literature should not be going to before the researcher go into the field. Most of the early scholars in grounded theory, they claim that if you want to do grounded theory, don't first of all do a literature review. You can only do literature review after you are back from the field, when you have finished the analysis. Then you can now go to literature review when you are doing the discussion. That's according to them. But Chalmers and others said that no, sometimes we can go to literature review before we do the data collection and analysis. But we have to ensure that we follow all the strategies of reliability in order to ensure that those literature did not contaminate the data, the finding, as well as the analysis. Those strategies, we are going to discuss them later. So for this kind of approach, design, data collection, the sample size shouldn't be less than 40, as said by many scholars. They agree that because of the enormity, because of the complexity of grounded theory, because of the implications of the findings of grounded theory, the findings are meant to be used as a guide in solving the problem every time and anywhere. So in collecting the data, they said the samples should not be less than 40. The samples should range between 40 to 60. And for the data collection method, they recommended in-depth interview, document, and observation. That all these should be combined, that one method cannot be enough. So it's either in-depth interview and document are combined, or in-depth interview and observation are combined. That is the recommendation. Then the fifth one, the fourth one is ethnography. Ethnography is a design that is usually used by scholars in culture, scholars that are studying the culture as well as custom of people. So ethnography, the word ethno means people, or their culture, or their custom. That's what ethno means. Then the graphy there, the graphy means writing, documenting, recording. So you can see the combination of ethnography means studying people and their culture, writing about the people and their culture. Now with the advent of social media, with the advent of internet, with the advent of online, the scholars have now coined and propounded nethnography. They call it nethnography. Net was derived from internet. Nethnography. It means studies of people's culture through online platform or social media platform. With Facebook, we can study people's culture. We can know the way people behave, people interact, the way people respond to issues. We can know through Facebook, through WhatsApp, through Instagram, and other platforms that we usually come across online. That is why they now have nethnography, studying of people's culture and custom through internet, nethnography. But generally, whether ethnography or nethnography, it is all about understanding people's culture. It is all about knowing why people behave in a certain way. It is all about knowing why certain behavior possibly has continued to affect development either of the people or of the environment. So most of the scholars using this design are scholars of culture, people who study culture, maybe from sociology, from communication, from psychology. These are people that usually use ethnography as a design. So the design is meant to understand people's culture. It was strictly propounded to study people's culture. And the focus is usually about why people behave in a certain way, why conflict usually happen between two communities. Often, is it about their culture? Is it about their behavior? Or is it about their custom? So some people, because of the way they cherish land, they hold it dearly. So anything that affected it, it turned to conflict. So to understand this culture, ethnography is usually used. So it is used to uncover, to discover people's behavior in a specific way, in a specific setting. We can see the picture on the screen in the slide. That is an example of an ethnographer who is involved in a participant observation to understand this group of people, musical prowess. Maybe they discovered that they were so prowess in music in spite of their uncivilization, in spite of their crude ways of life. So this ethnographer was trying to know their custom, their culture in relation to music. So as we are seeing it, that is a participant observation. And that is a means of data collection in this kind of a research design. The number is not specific. Once it is a group of people with similar culture, that is the sample size. There's no specific number to study, but a group of people practicing the same custom, believing in the same culture. So when they are being studied, that is the sample. No number, no specific sample size. But the method of data collection is only participant observation, meaning that the researcher has to be part of them in order to understand them. So then the fifth one, case study. Case study is another design in qualitative studies. Case study has to do with looking for one unit to study in order to understand other people. A community can be understood when a case is picked, is selected from that community, as long as they operate the same behavior. So when we pick one person out and study that person, we can easily understand behavior of the community. Case study is used where the entire community cannot be studied, and all we need to know is their behaviors, is their reactions, is their attitude, or the way they are being affected by certain things. So because we have one person selected, the belief is that that one person, when studied properly, the researcher can get to understand the community generally. For instance, we may want to know the impact. Why is it that certain community is not affected by the spread of coronavirus? A study can employ case studies. We can just single out one person in that community. Then we follow him through his life pattern, maybe for a whole day. We look at what he eats, we look at where he goes, we look at how he farms, we look at what they do that make them to be immune from certain disease. Or we can look at a selected case, see his behavior on certain things, on politics, on whatever, in order to understand the entire people. It is called case study because one person is selected out of all for the study. Just like the picture you are seeing, the person, the researcher will have to select just one person. It is that one person that will be studied in order to understand other people. For instance, some of us are conversant with channels that shows animals, maybe geographical channels, discovery channels, where they show us behaviors of animal, how animal mates, how animal deliver, how animal live in their jungle, and how animal behave generally. In order to understand the world of animal, researchers, they select one case, that is, they select one animal, Having selected that animal, they will now implant cameras and microphones onto that animal, that single animal selected. So that animal will be referred to as case. So it is that animal, after being implanted with gadgets, they will now release the animal to the natural habitat. So believing that that single case of animal will now be giving information about what is happening. Everywhere he goes, the camera is working, the researcher is recording, and the researcher is getting to know the behavior of animal in their natural setting. So this is a case. We all remember that sometimes ago in Zimbabwe, one lion was killed by a poacher. That lion really shocked, the killing of that lion shocked the whole world, because that lion was a significant case being used to understand the attitude and behaviors of animals in the jungles, in the forest, in the reserve, animal reserve in Zimbabwe. I've forgotten, maybe the animal's name is Cecil or something like that. The animal is highly prized animal. Government is collecting money from the usage of that animal as a case. Researcher in Australia, they get information on researches through that animal, but somebody just kill it. Immediately the animal was killed. The researcher get to know in Australia, even before the security in the animal forest get to know. So a case is a selected entity that is being used to study, to examine the entire system. If we are conversant with the way most of these international TV stations do their recording, their reports, whenever they are looking at a problem, they look at it from one person. Al Jazeera, for instance, CNN, BBC, all they do is they will pick one person, try to study him and see how a disease is affecting the community, but from the life of one person. So case study is used often in academic research, in donor-sponsored research, in evaluations and monitoring. For instance, evaluation can be carried out on certain projects constructed by government, by NGO. In order to know the usefulness of the project, a case study can be used to study how that community have been enjoying that project by picking on one person in that community and study his life, maybe for 24 hours, maybe for 48 hours, maybe for 3 days, maybe for 1 week, just to know the life cycle, just to know the behaviors of that person. And to collect data for this kind of method design, it is by observations. An in-depth interview as well as document can be used. It can be observation like in the animal we talked about. It can be in-depth interview, and it can be the documentary. Then the last approach, the sixth approach, is mixed method approach, mixed method design. We have to talk about mixed method design because, number one, many problems these days require mixed method. Most academic researchers, especially at PhD level, at master's level, they are expected to contribute significantly to the body of knowledge, to solving problem in the society. Sometimes when we use one method, it may not be adequate, it may not be enough, and it may not generate findings that will be so meaningful. Even some donor agencies, some NGOs, when they sponsor research, they always want the researcher to look at that problem from all angles. And some problems are so complex that only quantitative may not be enough. Only qualitative may not be enough. So there are situations that we need to combine mixed method in order to get to the bottom of the problem we are trying to examine. So that is why mixed method is referred to as the third leg of research. The first leg is quantitative. The second leg is qualitative. The third leg is combination of the two to become mixed method. So mixed method is good for us to understand so that when the need arises to combine the method, we have to know. That is why the quantitative aspects you've been exposed to or you will be exposed to, which Mr. Peter will take, is an opportunity. Then the qualitative approach, which we are doing now, it's another opportunity. Once you have understanding of the two legs, then you are good to go on any kind of studies. So mixed method as a design, the basic thing to consider when we are trying to design a mixed method study is that we should have basic knowledge, basic ideas about the two methods. For instance, just a minimal understanding of quantitative, a minimal understanding of qualitative, then you are good to go in mixed method. So our understanding of the two methods is what will give us advantage in mixed method. Then again, in designing mixed method, the theoretical lens must be understood. When we say theoretical lens, we're talking about in what way can theory come into our studies? To what extent can we use theory to carry out the qualitative? You remember I said the other time that sometimes we can bring in deductive even for our qualitative. Sometimes we can use both methods to carry out our studies. So that is what they mean by theoretical lens. Then the sequence, how do we want to do the research? Which one will come first? Which one will come last? What time will one come? What time will the other come? So we are saying that at what stage do you want to bring in the two methods? If your research is a mixed method, you use quantitative, you use qualitative. At what point will you integrate the two findings? This must be understood, and we are going to discuss it next now. So a researcher who is using the two methods must understand when to integrate the two methods. Then again, the researcher must understand the purpose, the reason, the rationale for using mixed method. It cannot just be used without justification. Justification may be that the issue we are looking at is complex. The justification may be that the quantitative is my approach, for instance, but not many studies have been carried out in that area. So I need to explore first to know the direction I want to go. Okay, maybe we need an instrument. Our method is quantitative, for instance, and you know, a quantitative researchers will need instruments, questionnaire, sometimes we call it items for our research. If we can't get the instrument, then we develop one. And to develop the instrument, there is a need to, first of all, introduce qualitative approach to get some of the data you will need, to get some of the things you will need to develop the questionnaire, then follow the other process. So mixed method can be required in that also. You will get to understand that better as we move on. Then, if we need to know again, as a researcher using mixed method, we need to know the types of data They will be given more priority. Definitely, if we are doing mixed method, there will be one approach that will be given priority. You see, the quantitative data, that is our dominant, that is our predominant, while qualitative is just a complementary. Or is it the qualitative that is the dominant, that is the main, while quantitative is the supplementary? So all this we need to know before we set out into mixed method. Then again, finally, we must clearly define and illustrate our design. What this means is that we should explain how, in what order, in what arrangement do we want to collect the data, in what arrangement do we want to analyze, in what arrangement do we want to report the findings. These are things we need to know as a researcher using mixed method. So now let's get to understand more before we move on to how we can combine the mixed method. So we said mixed method design is applied whenever the issue we are looking at is complex. Whenever the issue we are looking at is so serious that one method cannot be used for, especially in the case of monitoring and evaluation, study that has to do with sustainable development. Okay, so there are studies that look at development that are complex beyond the expectation of one method. So we should know. The mixed method can be used for these certain cases. When we want to triangulate, the researcher needs to use mixed method. That is when we want to move from one method to the other in order to understand something deeper. We need to combine the method. When we want to complement, when there is a need to bring in another method to complement the original method in order to have detail. So mixed method can be useful whenever we want to elaborate, we want to enhance. Then development, as we talk about, whenever we want to develop a method, the researcher may need to use one method to help develop the other. It is possible that you don't have much, you don't know what to ask, you don't know what to go for in quantitative, as I've said. You can use one method to develop the other. Then initiation, researcher may use mixed method when looking for contradiction. Maybe the study require knowing, making comparison, trying to know what is it that is the contradiction in the reason why people behave in certain way. Why is it that some people obey the law? Why is it that some people don't obey the law? That means there is a contradiction there. A mixed method helps to initiate, to know why the North is behaving differently from the South, why the West is behaving differently from the East. So this kind of method design can be used to generate that. Then expansion. Maybe after carrying out the quantitative, many things came up that are not answered. So, and there is a need to cover them, especially if the work is a sponsor research, if it is academic research at the higher level. The limitation supposed not to be wide. The study need not leave out anything untouched, especially in relation to the focus. So now let's look at a different form of mixed method. Different form of a mixed method and how we can apply them. There are basically 4 types of mixed method which researcher can apply. The first one is exploratory. Exploratory is when, as I've said the other time, when you don't know much about the area you are studying. Your study is quantitative, but you don't know how you want to go about it. Maybe there are not much studies on that area. Maybe theory did not give specific guides on how to go about it. In this case, you are going on exploratory. You have to explore the field. You have to explore the cases before you move into your main studies. So in this case, you will first of all apply qualitative method, qualitative approach. And in doing that, you will set out to collect your data. And you know why qualitative is good for exploratory first to help your quantitative is because qualitative does not require developing an instrument, making sure your instrument is valid, making sure your instrument has been tested. All that are not necessary in qualitative. All you need to understand in qualitative to set out is to have specific things you want to explore, specific problem you want to explore. Once you have it, it is an open-ended. Just throw the question to your guest, to your sources. The answers will be coming. From the answers, you can generate dimensions. You can generate variables. You can generate even constructs or concepts that will guide your quantitative. So it is called exploratory because qualitative will first of all be used to collect data. After collecting the data, you will do the analysis, qualitative analysis. Then the findings you have from qualitative will definitely raise many questions. We raise many answers. We raise many variables. So those variables will now be used to develop, to begin your quantitative. So exploratory is using when the finding of qualitative analysis will inform the content of the quantitative survey. So sometimes when you want to develop instruments and you don't have, you can go on using qualitative first to help you generate issues, to help you generate words, to help you generate ideas, concepts that will form your instrument. So after that, you will now move into your quantitative. So in this case, it is referred to exploratory. You first of all explore. Explore means you move into unknown land, unknown world, unknown journey, unknown studies. That's what exploration means, when you explore. So this is one approach of mixed method. It is the responsibility of the researcher to know which one to use and which one is suitable to his studies. The second one is explanatory mixed method. This approach of mixed method is when you want to start your work. Your work is quantitative. If your work is quantitative and you have gone to the field, you have collected data using your quantitative method, you have done the analysis quantitatively, and questions were raised. If many questions were raised that needed to be answered, then there is a need to bring in qualitative to provide insight into the findings of quantitative that have not been answered. I said there are some donor agencies, there are some sponsors, there are some NGO that will not want to take reports of some studies if more questions were generated than answers. They will want you to find answer to those questions. If one is even academic research at PhD level, there are some questions you are expected to answer. If those questions were raised through your quantitative, it won't be acceptable for you to leave the questions unanswered. So in that case, you bring in qualitative to do more, to get more explanation. That is why this approach is called explanatory. You have done it quantitatively and more questions came up. You need to explain them. So qualitative will help in throwing more light, in answering more questions that were raised in the quantitative. So that is why explanatory mixed method sometimes can be necessary. You may not even plan to use qualitative. Maybe your plan is to use only quantitative. But at the end of your analysis of quantitative, more questions were raised that quantitative cannot be answered. Then you have no choice than to bring in qualitative. So in that case, you change your method, you change your design from quantitative to mixed method because you are introducing another approach. Then the fourth one, the third one is a embedded mixed method. Embedded mixed method is when you bring in the two methods. When you use the two methods, you embedded it. When it is similar to explanatory, the only difference is that the data for embedded are collected concurrently. They are collected concurrently. And the finding of one is not informing the design of the other. Let's look back, unlike in the explanatory and exploratory. In exploratory, the finding of the qualitative is going to help quantitative. That means it is informing, it is directing, it is guiding the quantitative. In explanatory, the finding of the quantitative is informing qualitative. It is necessitating qualitative. But in this case, embedded, the two methods are collected concurrently. The analyses are done concurrently. The intention, the objective here is to let the two methods inform the findings, not one method informing the other method. But when we want the two methods to inform our findings, when we want the two methods to reflect in our findings, meaning that we are only using it, finding of one method to explain the finding of the other, that's not. But when the two findings are joined together to determine our final finding of the studies. That is why it is explained that the finding of one are not informing the design of the other, but the finding of one might inform or explain the findings of the others. So it means one cannot wait for the finding of other before we set out to the field. We can go to the field concurrently. After collecting your data quantitatively, drop it. Before you do the analysis, go to the field for qualitative too. When you now back with the two data, you now do the analysis of one, drop it, do the analysis of the other. Now, the findings from the two methods will now combine together to inform your final finding. So one is not helping the other in this case. Both of them are coming to help the findings, but not the method. I hope that is clear. Now, the last method, the fourth one, it is called triangulation mixed method. Sometimes they call it concurrent design, in the sense that it's the same like embedded. The data collection for quantitative will be carried out. The qualitative will be carried out. The analysis of quantitative will be carried out. The qualitative will be carried out. At the end of the day, we now combine the two findings. So the two findings will now validate our results. So it is this kind of mixed method. It is used to validate the study's finding by comparing the finding from the same sample to determine if they reach the same conclusion. What are we saying here? Let's say, for instance, your quantitative has 200 samples, for instance. So you have examined them, you have given them questionnaire, they have answered the questionnaire, you have collected the questionnaire from the 200 samples. So from these 200, you now pull out maybe 20 of them, 30 of them, 40 of them. You now subject them to qualitative interview. So the finding from quantitative, you analyze it. That's 200 questionnaire. The finding from qualitative, you analyze it. That is from 20 samples. So the analysis, mind you, you are using the same sample, the same group of people, only that for qualitative, you only pick 20 out of the 200. So it means the 20 you have picked will have answered your questionnaire in quantitative. So at the end of the day, you want to compare the finding from the two methods to see whether the method whether your findings are valid. Because it is possible that the way they answer your quantitative will be different from the way they answer your qualitative. The same set of people, the same question you subject them to. So it is this method is used to validate, to make the finding to be very, very strong. So this may be necessary if you want to compare. You want to be sure that you have examined the problem from all sides before you can make conclusion, before your conclusion can be found to be very, very solid. So that is when these approaches can be used. 4 of them: exploratory, explanatory, embedded, and triangulations. All of them are used differently for different reasons, but all of them are variants of a mixed method. Now, we talked about interview the other time. The interview can be used in our single collection of data through qualitative. It can also be used even in our combination of mixed method with quantitative. So interview is usually used because of its advantages. The group pressure is eliminated when you are interviewing one-on-one interview. When you are dealing with sensitive matter, one-on-one interview can be helpful because it is one person at a time. But if you are dealing with non-sensitive matter, yes, focus group interview can be used, because remember, you are going to group people together, different people together. Some issues may not be discussed openly by some people when they see other people seated. So focus group is not encouraged when the matter is sensitive, when the people may be so timid to open up. So such is better to be used for in-depth interview, that's face-to-face. So in in-depth interview or face-to-face interview can be conducted anywhere. But for focus group, you have to have a designated place where you're going to have a table, where you're going to make them to sit down and throw the question to them and let them answer it. So for a qualitative focus group, generate more data quickly and easily. Once you are able to gather people together, it is very easy to generate enough data within 2-3 hours of your focus group interview. But for face-to-face interview, that is one-on-one in-depth. It may take a long time to generate data. For instance, you may interview one today, another one tomorrow, or another one next tomorrow. Interview may be canceled. You have to go to different locations to meet them for interview. So it takes time. But focus group, the most difficult thing about focus group is to gather people together. Once you are able to gather them together, up you can go and generate enough data within the shortest period of time. Focus group, as you said, shouldn't be more than 9, 8, 7, then shouldn't be less than 3, because once they are more than 9. It will be difficult to control and it will be difficult to manage. Like the picture you are seeing, that's an example of focus group where the researcher has to coordinate them. So it is always recommended that focus groups should not be more than 9. Once you're having more than 10, 12 people, it is advisable to group them into 2. So it is better to have 2 groups, maybe 2 groups of 4, 4, or 2 groups of 5, 5, or 2 groups of 6, 6. Though it yields enough information within a short period of time. Now, one area in qualitative that is usually problematic, that many people usually criticize, for instance, qualitative for some time was not acceptable to some scholars. The scholars that are referred to as positivists, they disagree, saying that qualitative is not scientific. But right from early 60 up to this day, qualitative has gained a strong ground in research across discipline, as I've said. In medical, in nurses, qualitative are used very well because in nursing and in medical, what they're after is the inner feeling, the experience of a patient, not what the option he can pick in questionnaire. So they used often qualitative to interview their patient. There are things that doctor themselves cannot see. There are feelings of a patient that doctor cannot know. So they get to know this often through qualitative. They always want the patient to express themselves so that the doctor can know how they feel, how they are pain, and what needed to be done. That is why qualitative is used often and very much in sciences like medical and nurses, communication, psychology, sociology, political science. Qualitative are often used. So as I've said, population, sampling, and sample are usually the challenges. But there are techniques that can be used to draw the samples. The difference between qualitative and quantitative when it comes to population is that quantitative usually go for target population from general population. That's, let's say, the entire Nairobi, entire people living in Nairobi. That may be the general population. But the target population may be those who have experienced coronavirus, maybe those who have experienced maybe fraud, maybe those who have experienced police brutality. So in quantitative, the population is usually target population. But in qualitative, the population is usually accessible population. People you can access who have knowledge, understanding of what you want to know. Not everybody, like quantitative, you want to use target population. Anybody within this target can answer. But in qualitative, it is not just anybody within target. It must be accessible. And that accessibility has to do with somebody who has experienced the issue you are examining, somebody who has undergone the challenges you are looking at, somebody who fall within those who have lived experience on what you are trying to study. That is what they mean by accessible population. And in order to determine the sample of this accessible population, there are specific sampling techniques that have been identified, just like in quantitative too, where we have stratified sampling, where we have other sampling, systematic sampling. In qualitative, the approach to select samples is either purposive sampling, quota sampling, convenient sampling, or snowballing sampling in order to reach this accessible population we are talking about. Either of these are expected to be used. And what are we talking about in this? Purposive sampling. It has to do with a kind of sampling that will require you to go specifically for those that you need for your interview. The belief is that you already have your accessible population. Then within your accessible population, who among them has experienced what you are saying or what you are looking for? Who among them are the maybe people living with HIV? Specifically, that is what we mean by purposive sampling. Selecting purposively, deliberately, certain group of people that can answer your questions. Not just anybody. Qualitative is about the richness of the data you collect, not the largeness of your samples. Quantitative, the largeness of the sample matters. That is why there are selection of samples, tables from Kretsch and Morgan's, from Yarrow and Yamani. You can use their table to select your samples. But in qualitative, just go for the minimum number or maximum number that you need. The final samples will now be decided when you get to saturation. Similarly, let me mute everybody. Okay. Similarly, we are looking at quota sampling, where qualitative require that when the people you want to interview, when the problem cut across all ages, you are expected to have a representative, a samples across these ages, across gender, across class and profession. So specifically, quota sampling is required only where you need to ensure that people are represented across different characteristics like age, gender, class, or profession. Then again, convenient sampling is acceptable, is allowed when maybe the willingness of the person you want to interview, the ethics of research require that the people you want to interview must be ready to answer your questions before you can pick them. It's not by compulsion, it's not by force, it's not by threat. So the willingness, if for some time, for certain reason, some people are not willing, then it is required that you can select your sample by convenience. That is, by picking only those who are willing. Convenient sampling is also used if, for instance, you want to collect a data in a place and the place is experiencing conflict. Then it is not compulsory to go. Use convenient sampling to select those that are within the reach or in places where you can face it, where it is free of a conflict and attack. Then snowballing is usually another method. This snowballing is used where you don't know many of these people you want to interview. You don't know many of these samples, and you needed to get information from them, but you don't know them. So it is acceptable, it is allowed to at least, first of all, identify one person. Once you identify one person, through that one person, you can be referred to another person. You can, from that one person, you can be referred to another one until you get the number that will satisfy your data collection or until you get to saturation. For instance, if we are looking for people who fought in the Second World War, you know, it's a long time ago. It may be difficult to know them in the society, but they know themselves. Maybe they have annual meeting at Armed Forces Remembrance Day. So once you are able to identify one, it will refer you to another. That another will refer you to another until you get to the people you want, the number you want. So sometimes they call it chain referral, somebody referring you to another, or snowballing. So this method is also acceptable in qualitative, rather than having the excuse that, well, I don't know my population, I don't know where to see them. Then snowballing sampling technique will be applicable. In that case, you have to get to one person, let that one person refer you to another. Then our final slide for today has to do with strategies. I said the other time that at a point, qualitative was not acceptable, was not given enough recognition as required for a method, because quantitative has been used for a very long time. It was later that the idea of qualitative came about, when it was discovered that qualitative are leaving out certain things which cannot be discovered. That is when the idea of qualitative began. Scholars of qualitative sometimes complain of quantitative, complain that qualitative is not rigorous, it is not systematic, and it is not valid, or it's not reliable. So after a long time, the strategies to ensure reliability of qualitative then came up, and scholars, through research, series of research, they came up with these strategies. So it means that every qualitative researcher must understand these strategies. Just like in quantitative, we know whenever we want to ensure that our instrument is valid and is okay, is reliable, we carry out pilot tests. When we do pilot tests on our instrument, we run a Cronbach alpha, we run an analysis to know the Cronbach alpha of our instrument, in order to know whether the instrument is valid or not, reliable or not. So in qualitative too, these are the strategies that can be used to determine the reliability of qualitative findings. Usually, validity has to do with the extent one can replicate an instrument and generating the same results. Validity can only be possible in quantitative. It is only the instrument of quantitative one can use several times and generate the same answer. Quantitative instrument can be used several times, repeatedly, and generate the same result. That is why it is allowed for a quantitative researcher to adapt already existing instrument for his own studies. You can adapt it, you can adopt it, you can modify it. It is allowed because you can possibly generate the same answer. That is validity. Validity is not given recognition in qualitative because it is not possible to subject the same question to people and get the same answer. People have different experiences. People have different exposures. And the way people interpret experiences differs. The way people will explain what they have undergone differs. Even if they are subjected to the same problem, the way they're going to perceive it, the way they will explain it differs. That is why validity is not really necessary in qualitative. But what is taken seriously is reliability. What is important to be ensured is reliability of the data we want to collect. And reliability means how valid, how good, how genuine, and how thorough have you ensured that your data is reliable. So These are the strategies identified. These are the strategies expected of every qualitative researcher to always subject his data to. Number one, triangulation. A qualitative researcher is expected to triangulate his data from the explanation of the mixed method I gave earlier on. You will discover that one of the ways to ensure reliability is to ensure that sources of data collection method varies. So it is encouraged that researchers should use multiple investigation technique in order to generate a very reliable data. For instance, interview can be used, focus group can be used, observation can be used. By the time these are combined, the findings will be more reliable, will be more adequate, and will provide a genuine findings. So reliability of the data is a process of using multiple investigation for the sources. That is triangulation. So member check is another. By member check, it has to do with ensuring that the data are presented or the sources are allowed to validate the data collected from them. It is expected that the sources are given the privilege of validating the data you have collected from them. That is to be sure that, to confirm that they have not been misrepresented in the course of the transcription. So that is what they mean by member check. So it is expected that after collecting the data, after you have transcribed, let the sources confirm that the data you have collected from him is okay, is well represented. Then the other one is a peer review. That is subjecting your data to a committee. Some school has dissertation committee where data collected will be given approval. In some people, they call it, in some places, they call them ethics committee. So the fourth one is researchers' reflexivity. By reflexivity, it means a researcher must reflect on the process of the data collection, must ensure that he didn't allow his orientation to influence the data is going to be interpreting. The data is going to be interpreting, and the data is going to be transcribing. So that's what they mean by researcher reflexivity. It means that we all have different biases. We all have different orientation. We have different orientation. We have our religious bias. We have our ethnic bias. We have our worldview that differs. So we shouldn't let that affect our data collection. And to ensure that, it is required that the researcher must be taking notes from time to time at the point of collection. Things that are being collected and how is detaching himself from the data is collecting. So researcher reflexivity simply means the need for researcher to be doing self-reflection on the data he's collecting and to be questioning himself whether his orientation, whether his worldview, whether his religion, his ethnic, is not affecting the data he's collecting. Just like every researcher, you have to avoid letting your biases influence the data you are collecting. Even to quantitative, it can affect. If in the selection of the respondent, you did not follow the appropriate protocol, it can be affected. Then the other one is adequate engagement in data collection. Another process of ensuring reliability of data in qualitative is adequate engagement in data collection. It means Give adequate time to your sources to express himself rather than limiting them to a very short time. Some people wouldn't have expressed themselves adequately if you limit them to a very short time. So it is advisable that the sources are given enough room to express themselves. Then again, saturation should not be easily reached because some people, they will slate 40 people for interview. So at the end of the day, they may end at 15, claiming that they have reached saturation. That is not acceptable. If the researcher gives adequate time to the sources, definitely the data will be reliable. So then the other one quickly is, they call it maximum variation. As a researcher, where the issue you are looking at, where it cut across maybe different geographical entity, maybe urban and rural people, make sure you cover them. Make sure you let your sources cover both rural and urban. With that, you are going to get very reliable and very strong data that you can make informed conclusion from. Sometimes it may be ethnic groups. If the study should cut across ethnic groups, allow it to cut across. Don't just limit yourself to one ethnic group. And at the end of the day, you want to claim that your data is reliable. No, such is not acceptable. It is expected that give every group adequate representation in order to get a very reliable data. The other one is auditory. It's a strategy researcher can use to ensure reliability of data. And what do we mean by auditory? It's a process of taking account of every happenings at the point of data collection. There are times that your sources will be expressing himself non-verbally at a point. He may come up and do some gesticulation, do some non-verbal communication that your tape recorder may not pick. So as the researcher, you're supposed to have a feed note, what they call feed notes, where you will be documenting things that cannot be captured in the tape. Write them down. So by the time you get to analysis, you will be bringing in the feed note to assist. So auditory is the collection, the taking notes of certain categories that may be imagined in the course of collecting data. So at the time of analysis, it will be very easy to bring in the codes or the categories you have noted. It will be very easy to bring in the non-verbal communication of your source, because at times, non-verbal communication may be important. For instance, you are interviewing somebody and it has to do with his experience with certain thing. Maybe at a point he gives to tears, he started crying. Your tape recorder will not pick that. And that will be very, very essential in your analysis. So all these must be taken notes when the data is being collected. Then the rich and thick description. This has to do with, in the course of your reporting of the data, researcher, in order for his data to be reliable, for his finding to be reliable, is expected to let the analysis be rich. And what can make the analysis to be rich is when you use enough quotes from the source, verbatim quotation from the source's statement to do the analysis, raw data of what you gather from the sources, areas that are very, very important, use them as quotation directly as the sources has put them. This will help the analysis to be rich and at the same time thick. All this you will understand in subsequent discussion we'll be having. What we mean by codes, what we mean by categories, and what we mean by themes, what we mean by quotes. You're going to be understanding this as we move on. So finally, the ethical consideration. It is equally very important. Researcher must examine his relationship with the participant, his relationship with the sources. If, for instance, the source is the wife, the researcher is the husband, how will you ensure that your marital relationship will not affect the data you are collecting? This is equally important. When you are interviewing a minor, an underage, the ethics require that, number one, you must give a consent form. And a consent form is an agreement you get from your source before you begin the process of data collection. But in the case of an underage, a researcher is expected to get the consent of the parents, where the interview has to do with maybe explicit issues. Maybe it has to do with sexual orientation. It has to do with issues that underage are not expected to be exposed to. Then there is a need to either allow the parent or the guardian to be seated alongside the underage when you are doing the interview. So the consent form, then again, the researcher under ethical consideration that can ensure that the finding is reliable is to ensure that interview is different from an interrogation. A researcher does not interrogate but interview. It's only the security personnel that interrogate. So you cannot threat your source. You cannot force your source to respond or to talk. It has to be done on mutual ground. Then confidentiality of the sources must be guaranteed. That is why in qualitative, the name of the source are not required. As the researcher, you are the one that will give every source an identity in form of a code for you to understand who is this and who is that. Nowhere the name of the researcher is compulsory to be used. So confidentiality of the sources must be guaranteed in order to ensure that you have a reliable findings, a reliable data, and a reliable results. So from these strategies, when they are duly used, there is maximum assurance that the data will be reliable, will be useful, and will be solving a problem, and will be contributing to knowledge. Because we said qualitative is meant to generate theory, while quantitative is meant to confirm theory. So that is why qualitative is bottom up, while quantitative is top down. This we are going to understand more tomorrow when we come to the second class. Thank you very much for your attention.